Sunday Baroque Conversations is made possible by the Friends of Sunday Baroque and is produced at WSHU Public Radio in Fairfield, Connecticut. I'm Suzanne Bona. Thanks for listening. Don't miss an episode of Sunday Baroque Conversations. Subscribe on Apple, Google, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please leave us a review. If you want to find out where you can listen to our weekly show, visit our website, sundaybaroque.org, for a station list and our 24/7 stream. Again, that's sundaybaroque.org.
Randall Scotting is a singer, a countertenor. The American musician has performed at some of the world's great opera houses, including the Royal Opera House in London, Covent Garden, and the Metropolitan Opera. He studied vocal performance at Juilliard and the University of Colorado. He also lived in London for 8 years and was awarded a PhD from the Royal College of Music for his thesis on forgotten 18th century Italian operas. His critically acclaimed 2022 recording, The Crown, is a tribute to famed castrato singer Senesino, who was also the subject of that PhD thesis. And Randall Scotting joins me on Zoom to talk about his recording and his life and career in music. It is so nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with the basics. What is a countertenor? And since many people may be unfamiliar with castrati as well, if you would please explain that too, and then how does a countertenor compare to a castrato other than the obvious?
Right. Okay. Yeah, sure. A countertenor basically is a male singer who has this upper extension to the voice. It's a falsetto. It's like Michael Jackson or some of the old singers from the 70s, Justin Timberlake. They all utilize this higher part of the voice. But with an operatic countertenor, we're able to strengthen that and turn it into something that can actually project in an opera hall. And then there's certain roles that we take on with this kind of voice. A lot of British music, a lot of countertenors have traditionally sung in choirs. But the castrato roles are the really exciting thing that we now, countertenors now have the technique to be able to embody. And the castrati were these singers in the 17th and 18th century mainly, and they would train when they were young boys, and if they showed promise in music, they would be physically altered in the ways you're probably imagining in order to keep the voice high, and then they would continue to train, and they would develop these amazing talents. Like they would become sought after throughout all of Europe, and several of them traveled from Italy to London to Russia to Czech Republic, France, everywhere. They were really in demand, and so the most amazing music was written for their technical ability. And that's what we now, the countertenor, get to sort of step into, because we have a range that's roughly similar to this range of the castrati.
Good. So have you always sung, and how did you ease into that role as a countertenor?
Yeah, I actually started out as a baritone, which isn't that uncommon. It sounds unusual because baritone is very far away from the high sound of the countertenor, but it has to do with the physics of the voice. And when you flip up into countertenor, it accesses this sort of alto mezzo-soprano range if you have a modal voice, this low voice, as a baritone. So I started college as a baritone. I also studied piano, cello, and composition while I was just sort of waiting to see what was going to stick and what I was most interested in. And then a couple of years into college, I started experimenting with countertenor singing. I was really lucky because I was in a smaller town in Colorado, and my teacher there had studied on a Fulbright in Germany in the 70s, and he loves Bach. And so there were countertenors at that time singing Bach in Germany, even though there weren't a lot of them on the operatic stage like you might see today. So he was familiar with this, and when I came to him and said, I'm singing, with the sopranos in choir, he knew to pull me over to a piano and sort of see what that was. And we realized that that was something that I could make into a workable voice, and that I had some real talent there. So then I just sort of went with that, and I've never really looked back. And that was quite a while ago now.
Mm-hmm. So I'm glad you mentioned that you were also playing cello and piano. I didn't realize you played piano as well, but cello is obviously often compared to the sound of the human voice. And I'm a little curious to know too how your studies on cello in particular, but other instruments in general, maybe impacted your abilities, your approach as a musician, things like phrasing, things like breathing. How did that play into being a singer?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. The two things were really connected and still are in a way for me. This idea of so like if I was singing something and I just didn't quite understand how I wanted to phrase it, I would just go and play through on my cello. And somehow this sort of physicality, I'm a very kinesthetic person, and the physicality of just putting the melody into my body then sort of instructed, how I should sing it. And so the body has always been very, very connected for me in the way that I sing as well. But also just singing, I think, is connected in another way for me to playing the cello, which is that before I was singing countertenor, I was playing and I would hear these sort of higher notes on the cello strings, which are roughly equivalent to the range that I sing in now. And I think I just heard those notes, and when you play, you usually are kind of singing along in your own head with the melody you're playing. And I just didn't really build in the blocks that some people might have about that higher range. And so then when I started singing more seriously, I could just sing the notes that I was already imagining in my mind because I'd heard them right in my ear playing cello. And I think it made the whole thing kind of easier to transitioning up to singing countertenor.
Interesting. And I'm so glad too that you mentioned just the idea of, your body, because I know that you're also a pretty committed fitness buff. So is that something that you, again, always did, or is that something that you started because of supporting your instrument, or did they happen kind of concurrently? How did that come about, and how do you balance those two?
Yeah, to be honest, it's something that I avoided for a long time because I was really concerned that it would have a negative effect on my singing, that it would, get the muscles in my neck and my throat and my upper chest too developed, and that would cause problems. Even though I wanted to be working out and feeling kind of better in my body, I steered clear. And then finally, I just got to a point where I had to do something. I just was feeling unhappy in my body. I felt older than I feel like I should have. And so I just went for it, and I went to the gym. I got a trainer, and I became pretty serious about it. And then it really had the opposite effect, which is that once I started working out more, I felt more support. I felt more connected to kind of the diaphragm and the physicality of singing in a way, if you want to call it that. But I did have to get to this moment where I just shifted and thought, whatever happens. I want to be healthier, and I want to explore this sort of fitness thing, I guess. Yeah.
So the subject of your PhD thesis was a famous Italian singer born in the late 17th century named Francesco Bernardi, who went by the stage name Senesino.
Yeah.
Who was he, and what made him remarkable, and why did you choose him for your thesis?
Yeah. Okay, so Senesino is one of the more famous singers of the 18th century. I think people who are aware of Handel know about him because Handel wrote 13 roles, which are pretty famous today. Things like Julius Caesar, Orlando, Rosalinda, several things you might see if you go to an opera at the Met. They have these, in rotation now, and they were written for this talent, this amazing singer. But what I found was that we knew that repertoire. People are aware of these roles that Handel composed for him. But I was wanting to connect the dots and see what else was written for this amazing voice. And the idea was, I liked singing these roles for Senesino, the Handel roles. And what my sort of thesis was behind the scenes was that if I found other music that had been written for this voice, I should also be able to sing it well. And so it was about discovering this new music that I could perform. The PhD, while it's an academic pursuit, it was always for me about the end game of performing the music myself. I wanted to embody that music and feel what it would be like to sing it. So that led me on this amazing journey to, just digging up manuscripts in archives all over Europe and just figuring out who this singer really was, because there's also never really been a definitive biography of him. We, just sort of little pieces here and there throughout his life, but nobody had brought it all together. So that's what the thesis did. But the real point of it was to explore this unknown music. And I found about 114 operas in total that were written for him, and only 13 of those are the ones that we know by Handel. So it's a rich repertoire to explore, and I was able to find some real gems for this album.
Yeah, and none of it is Handel, which I find really fascinating. You've chosen these arias by 7 other composers who wrote for Senesino. Who are they, and why did you choose these specific composers and these specific works? What is it about this particular music that really got you?
Sure. Well, the sort of open door was Handel, and then the next step through that door was Handel's colleagues in London. So that's Bononcini and Ariosti, both of which have a couple of arias on the album. So I wanted to, during this period of time when he was singing these Handel roles, know what else he was singing and how other composers were using his voice and his talent in ways that maybe were different than what Handel did. So that was kind of the first step. And then beyond that, there's Lotti on the album, who was one of the first composers that Senesino worked with. And Lotti founded an Italian opera company in Dresden and brought Senesino along. And so he performed there for a few years. And that's when Handel actually first saw Senesino, was introduced to him, and then wanted to bring him to London, where he reached this sort of ultimate pinnacle of fame. So the composers kind of, they fill in those dots. They tell his story, I guess. The real special composer for me on the album is Giovanni Antonio Giai, who was based in Turin. He composed over a dozen operas. He worked with some of the finest talents of the day, and he had a lot of money at his disposal because he was a part of a wealthy court. But so he wrote some really interesting music as well for these talents, but nobody knows him today. Even people who've been working for decades in Baroque music and are real specialists, when I mention the name, they're a little bit surprised. And then when they hear the music, they're even more surprised because it's really something special. So there have been these kind of little discoveries with this album that have been really delightful.
Do you envision a follow-up to maybe include some more of those other composers you had to leave out?
I think it's definitely possible. I'm looking into other directions, sort of looking into other singers that might need to also be known today that have been overlooked, that kind of thing. But definitely, like, this is predominantly middle and later career for Senesino, so perhaps there's an early career album out there, or even more. I mean, there's so much to look into, so much great music. So there could be a later career album too. That would be a few years down the road, probably. I have a few other things I'm exploring at the moment.
And anything you can talk about? I know that you have a recording of lute songs coming out with Stephen Stubbs in like February of 2022.
Yeah, actually, today is the release of the first single for that album. So it's quite early, but we wanted to get it out just before Christmas to sort of introduce everything. Yeah, that's coming out February 10th. That's kind of an anti-Valentine, I guess. The title of it is Lovesick, and it explores this sort of, this melancholy, this idea of either being rejected or having unrequited love that was in the 17th century, especially a really popular theme in art and in music. And so we look at that from all different angles, and collaborating with Stephen Stubbs, who's this fantastic lutenist who also is the co-director of the Boston Early Music Festival, was really wonderful. We had a great time, and he brought so much to that. So I'm excited for the world to hear that. And also, it's not a traditional lute song album in that it blends in folk music from the time, and there's some sort of higher art like Purcell and John Blow too. So and there's a French song and Italian arias from the Venetian stage. So it's a very broad look at the theme of lovesickness. So keep your eyes open for that one.
No, will do. It must be very different too, though, singing really kind of in every way, musically and even just vocally, like singing with a lutenist versus singing operatic roles. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like how you have to approach it differently?
Yeah, one reason that I was really excited to do this lute song disc is because I'm sort of an operatic countertenor. I mean, I love delving into characters and telling their stories throughout an evening, and being on stage is really, I just get such a thrill out of performing, with costumes and lights and the whole thing. So I really love that. That's kind of the basis of what I do. And that is more what this album with the OAE, The Crown, that we've been talking about, that's more what that is. It's sort of bigger, broader gesture, more dramatic. And I just realized that people haven't really heard me do the opposite of that, which is this kind of more intimate salon style music. And I wanted to show kind of this tender musicality that I also have, in my voice, but that's sometimes hard to show when you're singing in a hall of 2,000 people. So that's been really fun for me to, with this Lovesick album, to explore the sort of nuanced, softer side of making music.
So I'm curious, I'd like to pick your brain a little bit about something slightly off the topic of the specifics of being an operatic singer, and just kind of talk more broadly about classical music.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the world of classical music, we've struggled for a very long time trying to be more welcoming, to be more inclusive. Mm-hmm. On the stage, on the programs itself, in the audience, boards of directors, administrative offices, all that. I would love to hear what thoughts you might have on how we can do that. How do we cultivate and be more inclusive of particularly underrepresented groups, whether it's young people, people of color? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, it's not an easy question to answer, just because these things are so ingrained in the institutions, and I feel like we are seeing change now, which is really encouraging, but also it has to go a little bit deeper. We have to start to see administrators, as you mentioned, people on boards, people that are making decisions that are more representative of this sort of broader ethnic landscape, of the United States, but also the world. And I think we're starting to see some really interesting things, like this repertoire that's starting to surface because people are just putting their focus there, and in a way it's rewriting the history just a bit, which is wonderful. We're sort of decentralizing the history. It's not just this like white privileged male view of everything, and I think that that's really wonderful, and I think we're going to see more of that, which is exciting. And also in terms of gender inclusivity, like I think in my particular voice part, we're seeing this real fluidity, which I think is, it's not me exactly, because I'm pretty, like, I guess manly, for a lack of a better word. I mean, I grew up in Colorado. I like to hike in the mountains, and that's just who I am. I like to lift weights, but I'm also very, very understanding and inclusive of all expressions of music. And I think that now we're starting to see some really interesting things with, I'm doing a workshop of a piece at the moment for Lyric Opera of Chicago. And the one character is countertenor, and then another character is a trans woman, but singing in a baritone range, because that's her natural range. And so you get this really interesting play on like the range of the voice and the identified gender, and how that all just gets kind of mixed up. And it's pretty exciting, and it's something that I think could only be happening right now. And we're going to see more things like that, which is pretty cool.
Well, congratulations on all these great things that you have been doing, including your recording The Crown and the upcoming release of Lovesick. I have been speaking with countertenor Randall Scotting, whose 2022 recording The Crown is a tribute to the famed castrato singer Senesino. Thank you very much for your time. It's been great.
Thank you. My pleasure.